Hey doing class, we are getting closer and closer to the end of the semester, and I want to make sure, given the number of class meetings we have, that we get all our material in for exam 2. Therefore, I am doing chapter 14 digitally. I will do chapter 13 in class. So chapter 14 wraps us up for the semester. And when we've been talking throughout the semester, I would say 80 to 90% of the stuff that I've been talking about, both in class and via the text, have involved individualistic North American or European countries. Individualistic US, England, Canada, Australia, and a few of the other European countries. The more individualistic your culture is, and I'm going to get to culture in a minute or two, the more what we've been talking about this semester fits in. Okay, let's talk about that. But we all know that the U.S. is not the only marketplace in the world. There are many, many other marketplaces, and many, many that are much larger than the U.S. Therefore, we have to think beyond our national borders. And usually, when it comes to selling globally, perhaps we have much more competition locally, and we're looking to expand market share and open new markets, so we go outside of our national borders. Now, many of the same fundamentals are true, particularly when we're talking about new school selling, when we're talking about relationships, and whether we're talking about long-term and trusting, and the whole CRM, CLV stuff. The old school selling was something that was pretty much unique to the U.S. for a very long time. The rest of the world, which we're the most individualistic culture in the world, it's much more about relationships. It's much more about long term. So us moving towards new school is actually a better fit globally. Now, some of this chapter, you guys are Stillman students. You've heard this before. You know what globalization is. You know what glocal is, local and global. We don't have to sit here and explain that for all the time. We can see that there are many companies, even though they're based in the U.S., their percentage of revenues, a large chunk of their revenues come from outside the U.S. The big challenge that we have as sales managers and salespeople is, even when we leave the U.S. borders, we can go within Europe, and each country within Europe is not the same. We can go within Central and South America, and each country within Central and South America is not the same. We have different culture. We have different legal systems. We have different values, Now, culture is what each nation, their values, beliefs, and morals that are shared, okay? Their expectations of norms. And a one-size-fits-all, we cannot say, even if we go Pan-Asian, South Korea is not Japan, which is not China, which is not Vietnam, which is not Thailand. These are all very, very different nations, and we have to treat them as different markets and different nations. Otherwise, we're not going to do that empathy, consulting, problem solving. Empathy is about seeing it from their perspectives, being able to walk a mile in their shoes. Well, how can you do that unless you understand their culture and their cultural values? Okay? So when we talk about cultural values, specifically we're talking about language, time, relationships, ethics, and nonverbal. Okay? Language, this is kind of self-explanatory. We have an advantage that English is a language that is spoken widely around the world. It's not universal around the world, but it is one of the most popular languages on earth. So we have that fortunate. But even if English is your primary language, there's still ways for you to learn phrases, some various things in the local language. Even it's as simple as hello and thank you and excuse me and a couple phrases that just having those phrases helps build empathy, that you're not just there and you're completely blind to the culture and the language. Granted, if you're fluent in another language, that's fantastic. I mean, I would love to say that I'm fluent in Spanish. I'm not fluent in Spanish. I can more than get by. I mean, I could make a presentation to this level in Spanish. It would take a while, but I could do it. It's not impossible. Okay. Time. Okay. Whew. Around the world, many cultures have different views of what time is. You know, my wife's from Latin America, okay? Latin time is not U.S. time. You know, U.S. time, 5 o'clock means 5 o'clock. In Latin America, 5 o'clock is not 5 o'clock. You know, even in business engagements, time is much more flexible. Asian cultures are the same way. And you could go to dinner, and dinner in an Asian culture, you can go to Japan for dinner, and Japan, it could be a 3, 4, 5 hour deal. You know, the pace, the conversation, the ceremony, you know, especially in Japan, South Korea, a lot of these Asian cultures, the relationship building is so important. They are almost the complete opposite of individualistic cultures. So, you know. Now, the salesperson and customer relationship, you know, there is no question that the relationships go much more beyond work, and they're significantly more personal. You know, significantly more personal. To the extent that, like, in Japan, workers go to work, and it's expected that you go out to dinner and drinks with your coworkers after work. I mean, you might not get home until 9:30, 10, and that's your day. You know. And in the U.S., we, as salespeople, we tend to we prospect, we have meetings, and we probably will make a buying decision within a meeting or two. And this could happen over a 1, 2, 3 month kind of a scenario. In Asian and in Latin cultures, particularly Asian cultures, those big deals never happen that fast. There must be, you know, again, they don't have our concept of time. Our concept of time is unique to the individualistic culture that we live in. They have a different concept of time than we do. And they like long-term building relationships and taking time. All right, ethics. We tend to have very strict, you know, legal, ethical. Those things are pretty much in the same column, okay? In many other cultures around the world, I mean, it says right here that France and Germany, that bribes are tax deductible, okay? In China, for instance, it's not a bribe. Gifts are very, very, very common. So much, they're so common that Walmart, China is one of their biggest markets, and it's really offensive in China for you to not accept the gift that has been offered to you. That many of the workers in Walmart, they actually wear lanyards underneath with their name on it, and underneath it says, "Please don't offer me any gifts. I cannot accept them." So before they even offer, you know, it's like having a big sign around their neck, because they were having so many issues over in China. But in many countries, bribes are not bribes. It's just the way business works. If there's not a little extra money being floated around here or there, deals don't get done. Now, nonverbal is a very, very big deal. You know, a very, very big deal. And simple gestures in our cultures have radically different and possibly offensive meanings in other cultures. In Australia, giving people, you know, this right here, that's almost the equivalent of giving the middle finger. You don't do it. In Japan and in China and a lot of Asian cultures, the bowing is very significant. And you don't overbow, you don't underbow, It is very important. In Japan, if someone hands you a business card, you look at the business card and you admire the stock and you read the name, and it's just like being introduced to someone. The business card has that kind of a meaning. Eye contact is still the same across cultures. Eye contact is still a very big deal. Also, weird thing, business cards. Sometimes we put business cards in our pocket. Well, in a lot of Asian cultures, the business card is very symbolic of who they are. It's like sitting on their face. If you don't put it in your front pocket, close to your heart, that's actually a sign of disrespect. Negotiation. Okay, here we go. Let me blow this up a little bit. Here we have American Chinese. I keep talking about individualistic versus collectivist society. We are very sequential. Think about the way we've talked about our presentations. Okay, it's very U.S. individualistic PowerPoint. Okay, let me go back. Circular conversation, long meetings. Yes, that's probably much more collectivist, more, we try to prevent a stronger argument, and in many collectivist societies, they tend to negotiate and haggle significantly more. Price is not price. Price is questioned for a very long time. Short term, just a good deal. Long-term relationship. We're very forward and direct. They're indirect and they question. We are very low context versus high context. Low context is we are more informal. Even when we are wearing a suit and tie, which we think as formal business dress, still the way we talk, the way we act, we could be in a suit and tie and eat at McDonald's. And in many countries, you're in a suit and tie and you would never eat at an informal type of place like that when you're dressed formally. So nonverbal. Okay. Logistics is something that we have an advantage being a very large country with a very strong airport, rail, and especially highway infrastructure. Logistics is something that's easy to do in the United States. Sometimes it's very difficult to do around the world. Japan is a country a third the size, roughly the size of half. I always get this wrong. That's what I'm trying to say in my head. Japan is a country that is roughly the size of California with 3 times the population. And even though it's roughly the size of California, people only live on about a third of that potential land because it's so mountainous. There's so many volcanoes and mountains that guess what? Not all of Japan is an easy place for humans to live. Well, guess what? Japan is very densely populated. And logistically speaking, you cannot drive a truck through the streets of Japan. They do all these little small vehicles. And those vehicles do delivery times at certain specific times during the day. Really early, sometimes at noon, usually late at night. So as opposed to like an 18-wheeler pulling up to a location and dropping off a whole lot of product, guess what? You can't do that in Japan. You can't do that in Vietnam. You can't do that in India. There's certain places that are too densely populated for that to happen. We also have to talk about how much do you customize for products around the world. if you want to sell products in the EU, you have to make sure that they meet ISO 9000, 9004, 14000 standards. Otherwise, guess what? The EU is not going to allow, it's a quality threshold. If you don't meet certain quality thresholds, you cannot sell product in this particular nation. Even beyond quality thresholds, when we talk about something as simple as a Coca-Cola, well, Coca-Cola is not a Coca-Cola, that's not a Coca-Cola. Coke modifies the flavor profile around the world. Our Coke tends to be much sweeter. China's Coke is not as sweet. Our cookies versus cakes and cookies in China, they're not as sweet. We have a much sweeter taste profile that we're used to for our types of products. We tend to be in more individualistic and formal cultures here. The price is pretty much the price. There's some wiggle room on it. In many other cultures, particularly collectivist cultures, price is not price. And we have to be careful. Just the same with nonverbal, we have to be careful with our verbal and our written language. It may sound ridiculous, but Chevy wanted to sell more cars in Mexico a number of years ago. And they figured, well, let's take a small car that's more affordable and let's put the Chevy name on it and let's send it to Mexico. So they picked the Chevy Nova, and they thought that this would be a huge hit in Mexico. And for those of us who speak Spanish, Nova means Nova, which means no go in Spanish. So can you imagine trying to sell a car in Mexico that the name of the car is No Go? No, doesn't work. We got to be careful of technology too. We're used to real broadband penetration here. In many other parts of the world, it's almost all cellular. If we go to certain parts of Africa, they leapfrog the entire cable and, laying all that hard wire down. It's all satellite. It's all cellular. So when we talk about organizational structures, we have to see what works for which products and which markets. They're usually global account managers. They tend to live abroad. They tend to be expats. They hopefully can serve a couple countries, like particularly in Europe. Maybe you'll be able to serve 3, 4, 5, 6 different countries, hopefully. It's sort of like being in charge of like the Northeast region, where you have about 6 or 8 states that you need to handle. Geographically speaking, the same distance between Boston and New York City, you could cross 3 or 4 countries in certain parts of Europe very easily. So guess what? You need to be able to have managers that can handle multiple countries and moving around. But we also tend to have some kind of a org structure that the global accounts can be managed. Sometimes it's just the org structure by product. Sometimes there's a matrix-like organization where these managers report locally abroad and then also to the U.S. There's multiple structures, let's put it that way. And we think about hiring people. If you can hire locally for the local market, the better off you are. There's less learning curve. I think it's easier to hire someone locally and train them in your company ways than have someone that's already known your company that's completely culturally, lingually, non-verbally out of the loop for a particular nation. I mean, if I was a salesperson and they wanted to send me somewhere abroad, well, okay, you could send me to Latin countries. I have strong familiarity with many of them. You probably could send me to Spain. But if you wanted to send me to Thailand or Vietnam or South Korea or China or Japan, my learning curve in those markets would be so much higher than if we were to hire a local Vietnamese salesperson with an MBA and us train them in our products and our knowledge for our company. I think we got all this. You know, the big deal when we're talking about motivation is in the U.S., we are much more linear. We're much more, couple presentations and close the deal. Motivation this way, we are pretty comfortable with earning commissions and bonuses. In many countries, commissions are almost illegal. Okay? You have laws that you need to be paid, and guess what? Most salespeople across many of the countries in Europe and around the world, it's full salary. You may have a sales function, but it's full salary. I have a friend of mine who has a sales staff in England, and England is very individualistic. England is much closer to us than not. And even in England, the salespeople are not as aggressive as the U.S. salespeople. We already kind of get into the compensation system. Full commission or half your salary being on commission is very out of the norm outside the U.S. and maybe England and maybe Australia. Canada, maybe. It's very difficult to evaluate global sales forces. Very difficult. Really, we tend to think in the U.S. about volume, about revenues, but what happens is when we go abroad, you have to have, a longer concept of time because it takes longer to close deals. It is a long-term investment, and if you can't think that way, our evaluation process, which is much more short-term, which is much more on the month or the quarter or the year, you can't do that globally as much. All right, very good. This is chapter 14. You have 14 digitally. I'm going to do 13 in class tomorrow. Rock and roll.